The next basic type of movement that I want to go over is a back step. And this is a preparatory step for various throws, such as headlocks and arm throws. I want to make one little demonstration here that will hopefully be helpful in the way you conceptualize throws, whether the throws are from the traditional back step or whether they're involved more arching type of throws. I want you to watch this, and I want you to understand how this little children's toy works. If I pull back this string and let it go, you'll notice the ball moves forward. I'm going to do that a few times. If I pull back this string and let it go, you'll notice how these balls respond to each other. Again. You'll notice when this ball strikes the second ball, it transfers the energy. And I want you to notice the direction that this second ball is going in now. You'll notice when this ball strikes the second, the energy is transferred, and this ball moves in an arcing motion away and up. And if you get this notion down in terms of wrestling throws, it will help you tremendously. Throws in wrestling, for example, headlock, an arm throw, aren't so much really what you're doing with the upper body so much as to secure it. The actual throwing action is with your hips. And it's not dragging somebody over your hips. It's not trying to loop them over your hips with your arms. It's being able to develop this same energy as with this ball to your partner's hips. This is my hips. This is my partner opponent's hips. And I want to be able to transfer the energy like that. The basics of the back step. What I'm going to do is first practice against the wall just to get the basic technique, and then we'll do it with an opponent. I want to kind of straddle out here, hands against the wall for support. One thing I want us to start out with is choose the foot you want to lead. When I do a throw involving a back step, if I'm exactly facing square, I can begin that throw with a reasonable amount of efficiency. If the foot I'm going to step with is back, that makes it difficult because it takes more time because I have more distance to travel. If I'm going to step with my right foot, I've got a much greater distance to cover. And not only that, my hips are facing this way when ultimately I want them to be facing almost 180 degrees around. So if I'm going to initiate an attack, say to my opponent's right arm, or do a headlock towards his right side, I want to keep my right leg slightly forward. That way I have a smaller step, and that way my hips are started already to begun its turning. So that will make your throw a little bit more efficient, as opposed to starting with the leg you're going to be attacking with or initiating that back step being behind, which is much slower, more awkward, and less likely to be successful. So I'm going to lead my right leg because that's the side I prefer. I'm going to step on the ball of my foot. You'll notice my heel is slightly up. My front heel is slightly up. Why is that important? Because when I try to rotate on it, if my foot weight is evenly distributed over the ball of my foot and my heel, I'm not going to be able to rotate very easily. But if it's on the ball of my foot, I can rotate much more easily on it. So I'm going to step, and when I step, I'm going to step out in front and across, somewhat in front of my left foot to this position here. You'll notice my hips are already turning, and you'll notice the angle of my foot, which was facing forward, is facing at a slight angle. Now what I want to do is I've got to thrust my hips in, and I need to bring my rear foot in, and it's going to help turn my front foot. So I step with my hips low, step to here. If you get that type of notion, you'll be well on your way to being able to do arm throws and headlocks. These are good techniques to have some experience with because a lot of people aren't real familiar with how to defend them effectively. So I'm going to step, weight on my front foot on the ball. When I step through, I'm going to help myself turn my hips and turn my feet in the opposite direction by clicking my heels. I cannot turn my hips quite as easy if I just choose to put my rear foot next to my front foot. But if I click my heels together, boom, that helps or facilitates me turning my hip, and it also facilitates me getting my feet in the opposite direction. Remember, I'm starting out facing this way, and I ultimately want to be facing the opposite way. Now, to review what we've done so far, I lower my level as I step in and across. My weight is on the front foot. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to follow up with my rear foot, and my rear foot is going to pop my front foot right at the ankles, and it's going to facilitate me turning my hip and turning my feet 180 degrees. Boom, to this position here. Now, as I do that, once I've turned my hips and I'm facing the opposite direction, it's important that my weight is slightly forward. I want my momentum going in the direction that I'm going to be throwing. Just like with my drop step type of attacks, I want momentum as I initiate my attack. So I'm going to step with my level low. I click my heels together and I've turned my hips. Now, my body is facing 180 degrees differently. My body is facing 180 degrees from where it was a moment ago when I was faced in this direction. You'll notice my level remains kind of low. I'm flexed here. You'll notice too that my feet are close together. When you throw, if my base is wide, I don't have as much hip pop or hip power. Whereas when my feet are together, I've got much better hip power when I'm going to do my throw. If you think about a triangle, this may make some sense. If I have a triangle that is the length of my arms, and pretend there's an imaginary line here, if that base is wide, the apex or the top of the triangle is relatively low. Whereas if the bottom of the triangle comes together, the top gets higher. And why that's important is the top of the triangle is my hips. If I'm standing here, the top of the triangle is lower so that I won't have as much ability to pop my hips to send my opponent going. If the triangle, if the legs of the triangle are close together so that it's a narrow base, I've got much more hip pop, and I'm going to be able to get more excursion with my hips. So my preference is always when I throw and do a back step is to keep the hips low and the feet close together, so that way I've got a lot of excursion, I've got a lot of space to do my hip pop. Well, we're going to be going over this more in the throwing DVD. I just want you to keep a couple of concepts in your mind for now. One is that my hips have to be lower than my opponent's when I actually go in for the throw. So part of that has to do with I step in low. Okay? If I step in without lowering my level and my opponent's hips are at about my hip level or lower, I'll be very unlikely to be successful with the throw. But if I step in low, in all likelihood, my hips are going to be lower than his. I do one other thing, though, to facilitate that, and that is I think of pulling my opponent's upper body up a little bit and over me so that I'm kind of pulling his upper body up. That's going to tend to pull his hips slightly up. And also, by pulling him up, that also helps me get my weight low. What we'll do against the wall is practice a back step where I'm just going to go back and forth to here and just practice this type of motion. I'm not going to be spinning all the way around, but I just get this type of movement down. So, in brief review, when you're doing your back step, keep one foot forward when you initiate your attack, and keep the foot forward that is going to initiate that attack. It's much more economical because you've got less distance to travel, and it facilitates your hip because your hip is already turned in the appropriate direction. Number 2, make sure that your level is low on approach and not upright. Number 3, make sure that you rotate on the balls of your feet. If my feet are down and my weight is equally distributed on the ball of my feet, my heel, I have very little ability to be able to rotate quickly. So when I spin, it's on the balls of my feet. The next thing that's important is you want to help and facilitate your turning your hips as well as facing in the opposite direction by clicking your heels together. Instead of just stepping with my rear heel and foot next to my front foot, I want to have my rear foot help my front foot. So I'm going to kick it. Boom. That facilitates turning my hip and facilitates turning my feet. Okay? And by turning your feet, actually, that's what facilitates turning your hips. Now, keep your body slightly forward. When I begin the back step, I don't want to keep my center of gravity over my feet. Just like on my attacks, I want my momentum going in the direction I want to attack. And if I'm facing my opponent here and he's facing me this way, I'm ultimately going to be bringing him the way he's facing. So when I step through, I am slightly bent forward and my weight is forward. And when we go over the throwing when we go over the throwing DVD, that'll start to make sense to you. But when you practice, don't just practice like this with your weight back. Keep your weight slightly forward. And you'll notice I kind of cheat a little bit by when I step through and I throw my hips through, my hips are slightly ahead of my heels as opposed to behind them. And what I want to do from here is pop my opponent. We're going to practice that in a second. Back. Okay, now the final couple of things in review is I had mentioned against the wall, I'm kind of in my mind's eye pretending to pull my opponent up. If I'm going to do a headlock, for example, and I'm doing the back step, but again, we're going to go over the headlock later. I'm just trying to get the footwork and the basic fundamental initial position and movement down. But as I step through, I want you to watch something. As I step through, I'm not just going to keep his head here and try to pop him. What I'm going to do is I'm going to help myself by pulling his arm and head up. And if I pull his arm and head up like this, that makes my body want to come down a little bit. And so that facilitates me keeping my hip low. It also, as we go over in a future DVD on throws, will help bring his momentum forward. So when I step, I'm not just going to step here, okay, and my weight's back. I'm going to be leaning forward, and I'm going to be pulling his head up. Here. And so when you're practicing against the wall, think of that. Posting, like you're thinking of pulling up your opponent's upper body as you bring your hip down.